Hi, Alejandro. How are you? It's so nice to see you today. I figured we could start with some introductions. You want to say a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you, Dr. Marilu, for having me on here and, kind of setting this whole thing up. I think it's great of having discussions about just mental health, about stuff that I'm really into, and likewise hearing other professionals talk about some of their passions and why they get into this work. So I'm Alejandro Sandoval. I'm a licensed marriage family therapist. I practice in Pasadena, California. Here I have my practice with a couple of associates and licensed staff. And I really specialize in working with men. Men and mental health is kind of something that I've always been really passionate about, even ever since grad school, and just working throughout the years of my career. But yeah, I really specialize working with men that struggle with emotional intimacy, men that struggle with trauma, and that just struggle kind of with connection. Kind of over the years, I really push that, and I see that a lot of men, when we're able to really connect with people that we love, things just kind of work out better. Life is easier. Life is a little happier when we can get to that point. So, yeah, that's essentially in a nutshell kind of what I do.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm so excited about the work that you do. And, I'm virtual therapist and I work in California and Texas. A lot of my clients are from Texas. A lot of my research is around working with the Latinx population of mixed legal status, so the undocumented as well. So I did research on that. And then now my passion is in working specifically with women in issues around intimacy as well. So I
Mm,
feel like we're kind of two sides of the same coin, which is so exciting.
yeah,
We need to be putting out more information around, how do we navigate intimacy on from both sides, from women who might struggle with maybe some anxious attachment, or, just general challenges in sex, love, intimacy, dating. And then also for the men, because gosh, there isn't enough out there for men to help them navigate, how do you communicate? How do you express vulnerability in a way that feels comfortable for you and promotes connection, right? Like that, there's so many challenges there. And yeah, so I'm excited to dive into this conversation and hopefully learn some things from you and vice versa. I think we need to be having more
definitely.
these types of conversations between men and women, quite honestly, and our passion is in mental health. And you spent years studying, how behavior works, how our mental health impacts our life. And then you niched out into how this affects men specifically. And as a Latino man yourself, which, you know,
Yeah,
I'm part of this culture, part of this community as well. Right now, there's so much affecting this community that we're a part of. And I know you have a big heart, as do I. That's why we're in this field, right? And so I kind of
definitely.
wanted to start off with that sort of what has it been like working with Latino men or working with men in general in this climate right now where our community is being targeted and we're experiencing so much fear and collective trauma.
Yeah, I mean, like anyone could imagine, it's difficult. It's very difficult. We talk about, and especially in the work that I do with men, different things that may get in the way to really allow ourselves to be vulnerable with people that we love, but more importantly, vulnerable with ourselves, right? Meaning being honest with ourselves, being able to look at and self-examine stuff about our patterns that we want to kind of adjust, change, kind of heal through, right? So if that's the premise of us coming into therapy or men coming into therapy and that idea or that theme, now when you have something very traumatizing, very scary, something that just injects a lot of fear, a lot of worry and stress, well, that just does quite the opposite of becoming vulnerable, right? So when we talk about vulnerability, we have to be able to really just allow ourselves, quote unquote, our defenses to come down, if you will, our protector parts inside of us to kind of feel more at ease. Well, when you hear this on the news, we see kind of the videos and we see maybe family members or close friends or just individuals that we've kind of dealt with, their colleagues that are being affected by all of these raids and just the overall climate. What that does, it just really increases and underscores those protector parts. It really makes our defenses, if you will, become extremely rigid and kind of almost working overtime, if you will. So it becomes much more difficult then to do some of the deeper work because you have this in the background, Right. And a lot of the protective parts of especially men that protect us from being vulnerable, they're very nuanced, right? It's very in between the layers, in between lines. It's not something very obvious. I mean, sometimes sure it could be very just obvious. Oh, this happened to me, so this is why I don't trust people anymore, right? Sometimes it could be just very concrete, sure. But that's not always the case, right? It's always little things, small, little kind of complex trauma, hurts and wounds. So that's why it's so difficult to kind of tease those out. And a lot of times when we're in therapy, the men coming in to see me or just people coming to see me, it's like, hey, it's harder for me to get to that vulnerable state. And sometimes I have no idea why. When we look at what's going on, believe it or not, that sometimes has effects on how we can allow ourselves to become vulnerable.
Wow, wow, that's so powerful. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and so it's more than just telling someone, "Hey, you need to let your guard down a bit and express more love, express more
Sure.
feelings." You can say that to your dad, your uncle, your brother, in the community, but it's another thing to do the work you're talking about, which is to dive in and comb out those nuanced traumas that happen on a regular basis and that are happening
Yeah,
collectively right now. And, I know
absolutely.
in the community there are these gender roles, right? And the men typically are responsible or carry a sense of responsibility for providing for the family. And when you're scared to go to work or when the raids are happening at your job, that's a threat to your sense of worth as a man, I imagine, right? Because if I can't go to work, what am I worth? Do you
Mm,
find that
yeah.
messaging?
Oh, that's such a big piece. That's such a huge piece, right? When we look at yeah, traditional gender roles, or just essentially kind of when a lot of men have this idea of learned idea, perhaps, right, from just kind of upbringing generationally. Yes, we are supposed to be providers. We're supposed to be protectors. Supposed to kind of lead our family, et cetera. Right? These are messages that are just passed down generationally. So, and as much as maybe men now may not subscribe necessarily to that full kind of rigid idea of what gender roles are, there's a lot more fluidness in this now, of course, right? It's still part. It's still in there. It's still very much in there. And I think that's kind of what I see come up more now when this stuff happens, right? So now when the fear is happening, right? Like, oh wow, there's a possibility that yes, maybe I might not be able to provide as well as I used to, or may not be able to provide,
At all.
period, for my family at all. So you can imagine, right? When this happens, yes, absolutely. The protective parts come out, the perhaps unhealthy coping skills maybe come right back out. We attach or we try to connect to anything that'll help us just ease some of this intense fear that we have, which often because yeah, there's these messages, well, I'm not living up to this kind of idea of what I know what a man is, which is to provide, to protect, et cetera, that are come from generations back, even if intellectually we may not even subscribe to that idea anymore, but it's still in there and it just comes right back up.
Yeah, yeah, and I love how you're separating a bit of like the intellectual, what you subscribe to and your beliefs versus this more primal survival instinct that comes through,
Yeah,
that there is a set of expectations that we carry on that primal level of like, this is what I'm good at. This is what I want to do. And there's nothing wrong with that. Even if we can deconstruct those and see that there is fluidity, I think that at our core, we have these very basic needs. And on the female side of it, on the woman's side, who typically, might be responsible for other aspects of the family, other aspects of the relationship, especially if there's children involved, right? Things are different.
yeah,
People play different roles. And suddenly that protective, whether it's a financial support or just the moral support of having a partner who is strong, who is capable, and now they're wounded and maybe overcompensating with these unhealthy coping mechanisms. Now the woman is also extremely vulnerable because she's kind of on her own at that point, right? Like having to relate
yeah,
to a man who is coming from this wounding. And that's sort of,
yeah,
where my passion is in coaching women how to navigate setting healthy boundaries with their male partners who are experiencing a lot of that internalized racism, internalized oppression, internalized discrimination, that maybe they're turning to alcohol, maybe they're turning to, you know, behaviors that are not healthy for the family. And it's not to demonize the men,
Right.
because what you're providing is this beautiful, nuanced context for that behavior. And that's what I want the women in my community to be aware of as well, because how do we set healthy boundaries? A lot of it is detaching with love from
Yeah.
those behaviors, right? And where
I
does
love
love,
that. I love that. Yeah.
yeah,
Detaching with love. That's so powerful. I love that. Yeah.
yeah. And where does love come from? It comes from understanding. So just
Hmm.
because we are deeply hurt by that behavior, that coping behavior, doesn't mean that we can't understand where it comes from, protect ourselves by detaching, but bringing love into it through that understanding, right? And
Yeah.
that's sort of where the woman's power can come in to help bring some of that healing. Of course, we're talking about this being completely compromised right now with
Yeah.
the political climate. The entire family system is compromised. So whatever dysfunction might have been there on a subtle level is coming straight to the surface right now
Yeah.
during these
Yeah.
times.
It
Yeah.
is. It is. And you know that piece is just important because it's a trauma response, right? Like it's the fight or flight or the fight, flight, fight, freeze, fawn response. It's this
Yeah.
idea of when things are just so overwhelming, when we're just so overwhelmed, it's difficult to kind of do some of this nuance processing, right? It's difficult to parse and tease out, hey, this is my adult self. This is the part that comes that's younger, that's carrying these traumas. This is me right now. This is me detaching with love. Like it's difficult to do that. And I'm glad you brought that point up because we really want to underscore that piece. Like right now, especially if you have loved ones that are being affected by the raids, by ICE, by all of this, you yourself or your family are, it's going to be more difficult to process. And I would even argue that maybe it's not time to process deeply, but just being able to survive. Right now, we have to put our floaties on, right? We got to put our floaties on. We got to just kind of stay above water. We'll learn how
Mhm.
to swim. Why? To protect ourselves. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't do anything, right? We still can do stuff. We can advocate for ourselves. We can look for places where we can go for protection. But I'm talking about the deeper inner processing work. That might not be the best time to do it right
100%. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. We're sharing information that can be helpful to come back to at another time, really.
now. Absolutely.
And for now, those floaties, I'm a big proponent, and I think this is like part of this woman power that I like to talk about, that we have so much power. Each of us have so much power that's unique. And part of it is that relational piece, right? Like it comes more natural for a lot of
Mm,
us women to gather and connect and relate.
yeah.
Not everyone, right? This is a
Sure. Sure.
generalization. It doesn't matter your sex or gender. It doesn't matter. In general, there are folks who tend more towards relational intelligence, if you will.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
floaties to me is all about connecting and staying connected and maybe delegating some roles, of
Hmm.
staying informed with the political climate, staying informed, but not to the point where you're taking it all in and getting overwhelmed because you're just one person, right? So
Yeah.
that's sort of my view on what do those floaties look like right now. But what are your thoughts on that, Alejandro? Like, how do we just stay in that very practical survival place for the time being?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a great question. And I encourage everyone to reflect on that and see how it works for your personal life. Um, the idea that I love that idea that floaties can be the connection, right? Your comadres, your compadres, like your system that you have, the people that you talk to. Well, I do want to just I do want to point out that for a lot of men, being at work and being in that network of working men, that is a big piece of their floaties. That is a
Yeah.
big piece. That's like a layer of their protection, if you will, right? Like even if they may not be talking about deep stuff while maybe they're working, they're around other males, around other men who kind of usually at least, right? And they can get this. They get some level of just protection, or get some level of connection. So
Yeah.
that's if they're being directly affected by a lot of what's going on now, they're not going to work, right? They're not showing up, or they're showing up with much more fear. So much more kind of hyper vigilance and awareness. So that is, if you can almost metaphorically see a floaty being taken off. So they
Hmm.
have one less floaty to work with now.
Hmm.
So it just compounds, right, the difficulty of the situation. So being able to just untangle that and see it for what it is, giving it a name and giving it context, then we look at, okay, well then what else can we do? What can we do to kind of keep that flow? We, I think especially the men that I work with, we need to call that out. We need to call that out and be able to at least be aware of it.
Yeah.
And for a lot of the men that I work with, they're realizing a lot of their own family members or close friends they're feeling betrayed by because they are maybe subscribing to what's going on. They
Mm,
are joining what's going on. So they're feeling this level of kind of deeper betrayal that they were not expecting, perhaps. And I think that that's becoming much more common now. And that's a layer of that's a wound that perhaps maybe it's easy to bypass. That's easy to name, sure, but I think it's difficult to understand how much that can affect, right? Just
yeah.
our overall kind of well-being. So we come back to your question, well, what are the floaties?
Mhm.
We really need to call out the awareness of what's happening, the wounds that we've been feeling, and find ways to really protect ourselves. I love the limiting the news, limiting kind of what you see, finding that balance, right? What is enough intake that I can have while I still feel that I can function? Right. And when I
Exactly.
say function, I'll throw the air quotes on there, right? Because a lot of us can't function right now, but we're surviving, right? So it's figuring out how much we can do, and yeah, finding people around you that you can trust and that do get it, that maybe are on the same boat or similar boat as you. There are a lot of wonderful support groups that are popping up everywhere now. A lot of mental health therapists are providing free support groups for folks that are undocumented, for folks that are being affected by everything going on. So I would say absolutely reach out to social media because there is a lot of help out there. Sometimes it's hard to get to the point to call. That's the difficult piece, but there are places that we can go to.
Yeah, I love that. And even though the functioning might be under a lot of strain right now, sometimes getting involved in something, whether it is a support group, whether it is a one of the marchas that are happening in downtown LA, or
Hmm.
some kind of action group, community action group, as much as it feels like, well, I can barely take care of my bills right now, how am I going to go out there and participate? Or like you and I, we have a full caseload. How are we going to take time to then go do something extra, right? It seems a little bit
Yeah,
contradictory, but sometimes the value and the nourishment of being engaged on the community level can energize you, and
absolutely.
it's about the dosage, how much of it and when. But I do see it as medicinal to connect
Yes. Yeah.
and to get involved on in some capacity, and limit the news in doses, and maybe get information through friends that maybe they're looking up certain topics and you're looking up other topics, and you can come together and talk about it and get a well-rounded information that way, rather than doom scrolling and getting sucked into one avenue, right? So there's these little tips and tools on how to help ourselves and strengthen ourselves through this time.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great way to frame it. There's a lot happening now, and advocacy can be very soothing. It may, to your point, it may feel like counterintuitive, perhaps, right? But there is a lot of strength and a lot of, it's like you're turning this kind of energy, this pain, this helplessness, this frustration, this feelings of betrayal, and you're kind of almost using that energy into something productive, and that can be very, very reassuring. It's not necessarily going to be deeper work, if you say, but it's like when we do with this, because if not, we
Yeah.
just stay idle with it. We need to use some of this, so that can be very powerful.
I love that. Yes, that's gosh, that's the foundation for, I think, all of mental health, right? Learning what energy is coming through us and channeling it in a way that's going to bring about healing. And so I'd like to pivot sort of away from this
Sure.
topic, which I know I could go on forever talking about
Yeah.
that because it's so important right now. And but going into the teaching men intimacy, right? This is
Mm.
such a potent tool. And I'm on the teaching women intimacy side of it. What are the things that you feel are most relevant for men to learn in when it comes to that?
Um, learning about themselves, a lot of times, like just growing up, Men aren't necessarily, and I'm speaking in very general terms here, so forgive me, but in generally speaking, men growing up socially, we're not necessarily grow up with these messages to reflect, to self-identify, to like go in. Men, I
Yeah.
think, very much are taught from an early age to go out. And when I say go in, I mean to go in about themselves and then share about what they find inside is what I specifically mean. Men are taught to, hey, go play sports, go outside, go work, get busy with your hands, be a doer, right? To do things. So it's and in that can be a very powerful, skillful tools to learn in life, right? It can be very, it can help you a lot in life. But there's this kind of piece where we kind of miss the other part of that, which is when we go inside and we can see, hey, I'm feeling X, I'm feeling Y, I'm feeling maybe these different types of emotions. That's the part that we have to kind of suppress, miss, not talk about, but we can talk about the stuff that we are doing, not what we're feeling. So a big part of it is as simple as it may seem, figuring out how we feel inside and being able to label and put words onto some of these things that we call emotions inside.
Mm.
A lot of times, and it sounds so simple, but it's very difficult when you have an entire kind of span of life, if you will, upbringing where that's not taught, or I would even argue that's shunned,
Mhm.
that's discouraged, maybe you even get in trouble for it. We talk about young attachment styles, right? When individuals grow up, like when kids grow up, they look for the parents, right? Like for the love, unconditional love that they want and they need. And if you could imagine young boys feeling XYZ, but not feeling safe enough or receiving messages like, oh, like, don't cry. Come on, don't cry. Get over it, right? Your sister
Yeah.
can, right? Because your sister is a girl, but you can't. So if you grow up with those kind of micro messages, right, it does teach you very at a early age that these are bad, right? If I show this, I'm bad. And
Yeah.
you kind of grow up with these kind of things inside, like, oh, if I show or if I access this part of myself, that's not good. People are not going to accept that. So a lot of it is just being able to deconstruct some of that narrative of accessing that big part of ourselves, right? Allowing all of ourselves to show up in relationships and with ourselves. That's how we get to the piece of emotional intimacy. And it's a long piece of it's a long journey, because on that journey we discover, oh, there's a lot of betrayal trauma, there's a lot of attachment trauma, there's a lot of things that I am labeling to the men I work with as trauma, but they maybe aren't seeing it as trauma. So I have to really kind of be able to see that for them and kind of, hey, explain, this was not okay that you went through this. We're not going to go into the blaming and blaming and blaming, because that'll get us stuck in cycle, but we're not going to co-sign some of that behavior that happened to you either.
Mhm.
So we're able to identify what trauma is for them and how that has also created big barriers and hurdles for them to connect to themselves. So a lot of the journey is that connecting to ourselves.
Yeah. Wow. That's very powerful. And I think in relationship, in romantic intimacy, that creates such a deficit in that intimacy because
Yeah.
now the man shows up with very limited capacity to relate to self. And if you can't relate to yourself, you can't relate to anybody else on that level, on a deeper level. Right. And so for a woman to have, and again, speaking generally, like you said earlier, but for a woman to be seeking intimacy and seeking a deeper connection, because we're wired for that. We're wired for feeling safe and feeling seen with our partner. And we hit a wall. It's like, oh, he doesn't see me. He doesn't,
Mhm.
he doesn't have empathy for what I'm going through. Well, it's because empathy was cut off at such an early age, right? And
Mhm.
and so it starts to create a little bit of that anxious avoidant dance that I see is so common in romantic relationships, where the woman is sort of pining for more and waiting for more and expecting more. And the man is feeling nagged and, pulled at. And so then he
Yeah.
cuts down more. And it's like, well, I'm doing all these things. What more does she want? I'm going to work. I'm showing up for the thing. I'm bringing in throwing out the trash or whatever kind of action
Yeah.
based forms of love are there. But it's like you're saying, it's more than just the external. expression. It's also about your relationship with yourself. And so much of the healing that is needed is around that piece, right? Like connecting with yourself. And so for the woman side of it, like coaching women, a lot of it is around understanding the wounding that is behind the lack of emotional availability,
Yeah.
and also learning how to provide that validation and provide that inner safety for oneself as a woman. That we're taught something kind of different, right? We're taught that we can't really do a lot of things for ourselves. We have to
Mm,
rely on a man for X, Y, and Z things. It's the man's role to do this and this is, and I know I'm speaking to very archaic traditional language, but I think generally it's still a thing. You can intellectually have a different belief system, but at our core, this provides the basis for that anxious avoidant attachment dance that is still very prevalent. And so for women, it's like, how do we come out of our internal loneliness and our internal sense of desperation and focus more externally on what can I do to provide for myself? What can I explore? What are my interests? How can I live a juicy life for myself on my own, kind of in the sense of autonomy, right? And that starts to create some of that container that we're kind of
mhm,
projecting onto our partner that we need him to provide. Well, if he's going through his
mm.
wounding and he doesn't even know he has trauma yet, you're going to sit there holding your breath for the rest of your life.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's kind of the basis of codependency, right? Is like
Hmm.
waiting for someone else to change and expecting them to fulfill you in some way. So we can go down so many rabbit holes with that,
Yeah, yeah.
but
Yeah,
what are
there's so many off ramps there, right? We can
so
take.
many? But what are your thoughts? This is just sort of what I've observed, what I've researched, what I've, done in
Yeah.
my dating coach work and my love trauma coaching. Like, but what's your perspective on this? I'm so curious from a man's perspective. Does it resonate, or is there something I missed in that?
Oh no, absolutely, it resonates. It lines
Okay.
up with a lot of um, what I see and with my clients is, yeah, a lot of the issues that come up with relationships, with marriages, with families, with just dating in general, right? Of like, oh, um, I'm this way, they are that way. We're just not meshing or arguing a lot, and a lot of it is, yes, exactly right. It's like our own attachment styles and how we receive love and how we express love, some oftentimes are not put in context with the relationship. So it's like we're going through these individual journeys, even though maybe we're in a partnership. I receive and give love this way, I receive and give love this way, and there's never necessarily any type of joining there. And I think
Yeah.
that's a big piece of this. And why is there not joining there? Well, we can just go off on a list. We have trauma, generational trauma. We have just fear, living in fear, being part of the immigrant experience, right? There's so many things that can get in the way. And I say get in the way because we're talking about this, but what get in the way means is protection, right? So it's
Mhm.
this thing that we can look at it as it's getting in the way of our relationship, but what it really is, that stuff is actually protecting us from being hurt again, right? So it's counterintuitive, right? So my own my own protector parts that are keeping me safe are actually also at the same time continually keeping this disconnection very present in my life.
Yes, pushing it away, pushing connection away.
Yeah.
Very, very, very true. So I want to talk a little bit about just a couple skills that you can
Mhm.
share on practical things. And I'll share one or two also of how do we start letting go of that protection and being more emotionally available for real intimacy. And then I want to talk a little bit also about kind of what brought you to the field and
Mm.
why you're a mental health
Sure.
professional as a man, as a Latino, like the why. So the skills and then the why.
All right, the skills of the why. Perfect. Well, I'll just caveat by saying that there is no silver bullet. There is no magic
Yes.
wand. There is no one intervention. One of the things, one of my biggest gripes of social media is like when I see those videos, like, oh, do this for this, and you'll have et cetera, right? Those kind of very kind of sales like things.
Yes.
I think that does so much harm because what the reality is that this is a very internal journey, and in a journey there are ups and then there's downs, right? I tell my clients this is a marathon run. This isn't a short 40-yard dash. This is a very marathon run. So with that kind of in mind and having that lens that is going to be a longer work with that context, then we start with, okay, what do I do?
Yeah.
As simple as it may sound, exercising or developing the muscle, the skill of self-reflection.
Mhm.
That sounds very simple, but believe it or not, it's a skill that can help us tremendously. And when I say reflection, I want to make sure we parse out. I'm not talking about just kind of ruminating and like,
Yeah.
kind of talking bad about yourself over and over inside.
Or
Talking about
cheese
that.
me.
Or geez, man,
Talking
that's
about
right.
cheese
Yeah.
me.
What I'm saying is like, for example, if you read something on social media or like whatever on TV on a video, the reflection piece is how does this affect my life? What comes up for me as I watch this? So the piece of connecting it to yourself, not
Mhm.
to like going external. Oh, this is why my parents do this. This is why my siblings this is why like so. We're good at doing the external reflection, right? Like, oh, that's why they're like this, they are this, they are that. But when we talk about, okay, but how does this affect you individually inside, right?
Yeah.
That piece that can start off that can just lead us into the right direction to go because that's a muscle, that's a skill that I think is going to help us in anything that we do when we're talking about dealing with connection.
I love it.
So, and doing some journaling with that, some self-reflection. Journaling is great because it's all open-ended. And if you're worried about others reading it, you can just shred it. You can throw away the journal. You don't have to worry about other people reading it or anything like that. Or some of my clients, the
Yeah.
same thing. Right, it's up to you. Or some actually want to keep it and they'll bring it into session and we'll kind of process kind of what they journaled. But another piece is taking the risk to maybe reach out to friends when you are feeling kind of down, when you're feeling kind of low, right? And this is a big ask, but I promise you, if you do that and if you share with your friends that, hey, I'm not doing great, there's going to be at least one other guy in your groups or in your circle of friends that also feels the same way. They just may not be ready or able to share that out loud. There's a good chance that there's multiple of you feeling very similarly, but it's hard to be the first ones to actually share that out loud. Get
Yeah.
involved with the circle of friends.
I love that. Yeah, and wow, that's a the right first step, I would say, because when we bypass this step, no matter what amazing precise tool you find online,
Yeah.
if you bypass this first step of that personal reflection, it's useless. So I
Yeah.
love that you kicked it off with that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. And so on my end, I would say I actually had something very similar. And I talk about this a lot, about meditation and about
Mm,
nervous system care, nervous system healing. And there's so much information out there about that, polyvagal theory, the body keeps the score,
mhm.
these kind of trending pop psych terms, but there's an ancient foundation to this, right?
Yeah.
It's been around
Yeah.
forever, and it's more of an Eastern concept. Us in the West,
Mhm.
we're so dissociated from ourselves physically
Yeah.
and mentally, emotionally that it feels like very foreign to do so. But just tuning in with your somatic language, which means like, what is your body telling you?
Mm,
Where do you carry tension? Is your stomach tight in knots? Do you have a little
mhm.
lump in your throat? Do you have tension up in your neck and shoulders, or maybe some tightness around your leg muscles, right? Like this is stuff we just tune out. But actually, when we tend to it and we sit with it, and maybe we do a little bit of exercise, we walk,
Mhm.
we do some stretching, we dance, we move our bodies and connect to our bodies, we start to develop that self-awareness on the more primal level, of
Yes.
what's called interoception, which is your capacity to hear the language of your sensations, your physical
Mm,
sensation. And for, I coach women specifically, and we are super intuitive. That's a real thing. And it's mostly happening in our bodies. I
mm,
mean, you'll have a gut feeling and you'll just really resist getting around a certain person, but you override it because you're not tuned in to your body. And, a month later, this person turns out to betray you and you're like, but I always knew it, but I just couldn't put
mhm.
my finger on it. Right. So I would say if we join forces, right, if we brought these two things together, talk about getting to know yourself.
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
maybe for the first time, and how that forms the foundation for any kind of intimacy is to be
Mhm.
intimate with yourself first. So I think those are some solid tips that we could, give folks something to hold on to
Yes,
with them. Um,
absolutely.
and lastly, I want to hear about kind of what brought you into mental health. Like, how did you get in?
Sure, yeah. Oh man, I mean, like anything, right? I'm sure all of us that work in this field, we usually it's a journey that brought us here. And yeah, there's so many reasons why I didn't initially start my college career as a with this in mind. I actually came in, I was going to be a engineer, electrical engineer, a E major. And so that was kind of my realm. Oh, I was, I like science, I like all that. So I was like, this is going to be what I want to do. Going into undergrad, I'm like, oh, I really like this very well. Very much, right? Once I started getting more into it. Anyway, so I started working in undergrad, as in the work study programs they have there in undergrad, and I got a job going to two different I went to school at UC San Diego. So I would go to different high schools in San Diego, and I would be what's called a college peer advisor, which essentially is helping high school seniors choosing colleges, juniors and seniors, like, oh, this is the UC system, the CSU system, the private colleges, the community colleges, right? So just kind of more of an educational kind of setting, right? And I would talk to the students one-on-one, and to qualify for this program, you had to be typically like lower socioeconomic status to kind of be into that program. Anyway, so it was Cal Soap in Europe. And when I was there, I started seeing very similar stories that I grew up with just around me, like, oh, students that maybe wanted or plan to do something with higher education, but of course there was a lot of just barriers there, whether that be very like external stressors and a lot of just stuff going on with families. A lot of, um, I didn't know it back then, but what I would call like a lot of dysfunction, a lot of pain, a lot of wounds, a lot of just symptom carrying. And I just saw it very familiar. I'm like, this is not just where I grew up, right? And I'm like, this is also everywhere happening. And it just started kind of, I felt like I kept getting hit on the head with it because it was so common. I'm like, this is just like a lot here. So I started to just naturally get interested in that. And I just kind of started going there. And I was really good at connecting with a lot of the students. And, it was, and I loved it. Honestly, it was so good. I loved going to work. I loved kind of talking to people. It just kind of filled me while I was doing my engineering stuff, which was totally the opposite. Right? I was like, this is what am I doing? Eventually, I got to a point where, okay, I need to do this. And I want to go further into it. So I went into graduate school. And there, of course, that's where you get even more of that skill of the self-reflection developed. When I was looking at what I'm going to do my thesis on, back then we did thesis and master's degree programs. It was this thing of what do I really organically want to kind of investigate? And it was, man, like I grew up with a lot of men in my family. Like there's a lot of us, right? Very few female women in our family in terms of cousins and aunts and uncles or whatnot. So I'm like, I have to do this, right? Because I kept seeing the same type of generational trauma, kind of the symptoms of that with all of the people around me in my family. And like this is a lot. And since there were mostly men, I'm like, okay, I need to figure out why this is happening. So that's when I did my research in specifically men and the barriers that exist for them to seek help, for them to seek not only therapy but just general help, assistance. And that's kind of led me through that big rabbit hole of researching, reading, and come now at my practice is what I choose to focus on.
Wow. Yeah. So it's really your own personal experience, your own lived experience that,
Yeah,
and that sounds very heart driven, right? Like it's genuine for you. It's something that came from your heart that is like a calling, which
it
is
really is.
the
Yeah.
best. The best therapists are doing it because it's a calling, right? And
Mm,
they've lived
mm,
it, honestly. I mean, you can't
hmm.
learn it in school,
Right.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I love that. Yeah.
And
Thank you for sharing.
and for you, tell everyone.
Yeah. Well, I've always been this super rebellious kid, like just a rebel at heart. And, I'm so passionate about deconstructing things, like, burning it down to the ground, like systems, institutions,
Yeah.
so I've always been really engaged in politics and art. I have a degree in art, and But mental health was all like psychology and the human mind was always like, to me, the root of
Mm,
all the dysfunction, right? Like
mm-hmm,
the
mm-hmm.
rebel in me wanted to burn all this down. And it's like, well, how did we get here in the first place? You know, who's in charge? Who's making these terrible calls in
Oh,
society?
yeah, yeah.
And what was their family life like? Like, because that's
Mm-hmm.
where it comes from, right? We're so malleable as human
Yeah.
beings. So, and then seeing the dysfunction in my own family, right? Like, we all have some level of dysfunction, and thinking as a kiddo, like trying to understand human behavior, and then seeing this around me and thinking, there's got to be a better way. This is not it. And so I
Yeah.
just kind of dove into seeing how I can change this
Mm,
norm, and channeling, like what you talked about earlier, channeling the pain, channeling the hurt, channeling the burden of responsibility that I felt into research, into like learning myself, studying my own self, and bringing healing into my own life, and then wanting to also share that experience with my clients, with the women I coach, with whoever's willing to listen, right? And so it
mm-hmm,
really stemmed from like this rebellious instinct inside of me that, there's ways in which we can learn more adaptive, more pro-social, more functional behaviors as human beings.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And it starts with yourself, and it starts with your partner and your kiddos and your dog and your neighbors. It really
mm-hmm,
does start there. And from there it can spread out. And then it's like, what role are you playing in the world? What impact are you having in
mm-hmm,
society?
mm-hmm.
Are you someone that's provoking more abuse in the
Mm-hmm.
world? Because if you are,
Yeah.
you probably have some really deep-seated wounds that have gone untreated, right? And so if I
Yeah.
can be someone to hold space for someone who's hurting and prevent them from harming themselves or harming their children, I'm willing to show up, and kind of be there. So that's what led me to mental health, really, and trying to get to the root of things, I guess you can say.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Just breaking it
Yeah.
all down. Breaking it all down,
Yeah.
Dr. Marilu. I love that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, well, it's been such a pleasure, Alejandro. I feel like
It
we could
has
turn
been.
into so much more, and I'd love to continue to have chats with you and, strategize and
Yeah.
gonna how we're gonna
Maybe we'll do a series.
yeah, seriously. So thank you again for
Of
your time
course.
and
Well,
right.
thank you, Dr. Marilu. Thanks everyone for listening. If y'all want to kind of connect with me, just go to my website, sandovaltherapy.com. My Instagram, I'm sure it'll be somewhere on there. It's Alejandro_therapy, Alejandro_Sandoval_therapy. And if you want to catch me on a podcast that me and some colleagues have done, we kind of threw a podcast together for BIPOC therapists talking about life. It's called Evolve Your Blueprint. So you can check me out there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alejandro. We'll talk soon.